So a little while ago, I reviewed this book, How to Create a Language by Jesse Peterson, and I strongly recommended it. But at the end, I noted that there had been another Conlanging textbook published last year. This is that book, Inventing Languages, A Practical Introduction by Carolina González. Now, I had been following the development of Peterson's book for a while when I heard about this book, which actually published a few months before the Peterson book. And I was initially excited. See, one Conlanging textbook is absolutely great, but having more could be even better. You could get different perspectives on the process. Professors could choose which one fits their style or even supplement a course based on one book with extracts from the other. Variety is good, is what I'm saying. However, I got a warning sign when Jesse Peterson, the author of the book I previously reviewed, mentioned to me privately that she'd seen an early draft of this book and had serious concerns about how it described conlanging. I want to establish that I wanted this book to be good, and Jessie wanted it to be good as well. And she mentioned to me that she hoped that the manuscript she saw had been rewritten. So when I contacted Cambridge University Press, I asked for both Peterson's book and this book so I could review both of them. And now, after reading through this entire thing, I can tell you that the González book is not good. It's not just bad about describing conlangs. It also includes impactful errors in linguistic data and terminology, poor organization, and serious issues in its pedagogical approach. I don't understand how a prestigious university press produced it, even if the editors aren't that familiar with conlanging. Let's introduce the author. Carolina González is a professor of Spanish and linguistics at Florida State University. She's originally from Basque Country, and in the book, a lot of the NatLang examples are from Spanish or Basque. In an interview from 2019, she discusses being inspired by J.R.R. Tolkien, a very common experience for conlangers. And she appears to have been teaching an invented languages seminar from at least that time. Just a quick addendum here. I did email Carolina González with some questions, just for some clarification things, and just in case these can reflect on what you're about to see in the rest of this. She said she has taught the course since 2014 every year, sometimes undergraduate, sometimes graduate level. She confirmed, of course, she's a native Spanish speaker. I knew that. And then she speaks Basque as a second language. And then she says she has particularly experience with Romance languages, and also calls out that she has particular experience with Panoan languages, which is a South American language group. I would not have clocked the Panoan languages. There are a few examples in the book, but it's just, I didn't see that like particularly among all of the other languages. And then she said she doesn't belong to an online conlanging community. She knows some professional conlangers, and she's gone to a few conlanging conferences. I saw that she has been to an academic linguistics conference about conlanging in Italy, but I don't know about others. Just wanted to put those clarifications out, just in case people feel that it becomes relevant in the rest of the video. I did note, though, that when asked if she'd invented other languages after her early Conlangs, she mentioned her pedagogical languages, which appears to be a reference to the example languages, what I call Examplishes, used in her class and likely in her book. We'll be discussing those a little later. I want to start out with the initial chapter. What are constructed languages? Just to set the tone here. This first chapter starts off with some definitions of what a conlang is and a little history that seems to dwell a little too much on lingua ignota by Hildegard of Bingen. Don't get me wrong, lingua ignota is important, recognized as the first known example of conlanging and establishing St. Hildegard as an unofficial patron saint of conlangs. But it's also just kind of a list of words she used to replace Latin words. But we are treated to lots of examples of lingua ignota and an argument that it should be considered a constructed language because it has some analyzable morphology, which is not really a standard I've ever seen used. She then has a short section on what can and can't be considered a conlang, mentioning language games like Pig Latin and Verlan, cants like Polari, and slang as things that aren't conlangs but could be confused with them. Notably, she does not mention ciphers or relexes, which most of us in the community find very important to distinguish from actual conlangs. I would much prefer a mention of that rather than discussing slang, which I've never seen confused with a conlang. But so far, the chapter is just some odd choices of presentation, maybe some typos. But the section on types of conlangs gets worse. The first term introduced in this section is naming language. Now, the concept of a naming language is useful, but I wouldn't have opened this section with it. Primarily, a naming language is not a full language. It has enough development to generate consistent proper names and maybe isolated words and phrases, but not enough to use for substantial text. They're part of conlanging, but they're not full conlangs. She mentions a couple of examples, including lingua ignota and lapine from Richard Adams' Watership Down. Before I get more into the substance of this section, let me quickly go over the three ways we typically classify conlangs. First is a priori versus a posteriori. An a priori conlang has all or most of its grammar and lexicon created from scratch by the conlanger. It may be inspired by other languages, but it's built of its own parts. An a posteriori conlang is instead derived from another language, often a natlang, but occasionally a conlang. The second axis is naturalism. Is the conlang naturalistic, meaning it is built to look similar to a natural language, or unnaturalistic, meaning that it's built in a way that's alien to how natural human languages function? And finally, we have three classifications based on the conlang's goals. Auxlangs, or auxiliary languages, aim to be useful for intercultural communication. Esperanto is the go-to example, but there are many others, including Głosa, Afrohili, Interslavic, etc. Anglangs are built as a way to tinker with and explore language, often pushing the limits in an interesting way. Examples include Loglan and Lojban, which aim for unambiguous syntax. Isquil, which encodes highly specific information into its words thanks to very extensive morphological marking, and Kalen, which is an attempt to make a language without verbs. And finally, artlangs, which are made for aesthetic purposes. The most famous examples of artlangs are connected to fictional properties, including Quenya and Sindarin, Klingon, and Dothraki. But the only requirement for something to be an art lang is for it to be for an aesthetic purpose. For instance, Trent Pearson's Idrani is a personal language that he uses to create handcrafted artifacts covered in calligraphy. These three categories form the Noli triangle, and a language can have elements of multiple categories. It's more of a possibility space than a categorical difference. Now let's see how González covers this. She does cover the three major categories, but her explanations are weak. For Auxlangs, she covers some of the same examples I gave, but she states,
Auxiliary languages, Auxlangs, are Conlangs designed to serve as common languages for people with diverse language backgrounds. They combine vocabulary and grammar from two or more languages.
combine vocabulary and grammar? Well, most of the famous ones definitely do that, but you can create a completely a priori Auxlang, and people have tried it. Peterson cites Kotava, created in 1978, as one example. Also, of Esperanto, González states,
one of the reasons why it continues to be popular is that it is relatively easy to learn, particularly for speakers of Romance languages.
I mean, Esperanto is pretty regular and easy to learn, but plenty of Auxlangs strive for that. I would expect that the popularity of Esperanto is more attributable to the fact that it got popular very early. It's kind of hard to compete against a community that was established in the 19th century and is still going strong. The section on Artlangs says they are designed for creative purposes, which is not how I put it, but it's functional. And she gives a similar list of examples to mine, though she includes Loxian, which I'm not sure I can find enough information on to judge as an example of a conlang. Again, put a pin in the choice of examples. In this paragraph, she also introduces the term fictional language, specifically for languages that exist in a fictional world, a term that exists but isn't super popular among conlangers, as well as exolang, with alternate terms of xenolang and alien conlang, which I felt kind of unnecessary. More on that in a moment. Then we get to Englangs, for which her examples are Ladan and Kelen, before introducing Loglan and Lojman under the term logical languages or loglangs. Keep in mind that Ladan is also listed among Artlangs, and it is acknowledged later as partly being in both categories. I would argue that Kalen is as well, so why not lead with the most pure examples, then introduce the in-betweens? But we're not even there yet, because after introducing these three terms, she gets in another paragraph where we're given the terms philosophical language and altlang. A philosophical language is an attempt to create a language that caters to a particular philosophical ideal. The earliest example is John Wilkins' language outlined in the 1668 book An Essay Towards a Real Character and a Philosophical Language, which builds his language on a list of 40 categories he considered universal. An altlang is a language that exists in an alternate history timeline. These are usually a posteriori conlangs, where the alternate history affects the trajectory of the language. A good example is Britannic, which is a Romance language that developed in Britain in a timeline where the Romans stayed there much longer than in reality. Now, based on those descriptions, even if you didn't know those terms before, I'm thinking maybe you can see that each of those were subsets of the three main categories. Like, philosophical languages are pretty clearly Englangs, and I would think most altlangs fall into the artlang category, though there could be some flexibility. Now, this is just about one page in the book, but I've spent all this time because I really think that González doesn't understand the three category system or how to teach it. We use the categories of Auxlang, Edgelang, and Artlang because taken together, they pretty successfully cover all the Conlangs out there. But González has thrown in extra terms that beginners don't need to know, miscategorized some, and poorly explained the main categories as well. I have to imagine that this is going to be confusing to beginners. She also tacks on the a priori versus a posteriori distinction at the end, not fully recognizing or conveying that it's orthogonal to all these categories. And she ignores the naturalism axis. Or at least she ignores naturalism at this point. Put a pin in that too. This categorization system is part of why I coined the term Conlang theory. We have terminology and frameworks for discussing what the different kinds of Conlangs are and how they work, and our methods of construction. And González is not doing a good job of teaching that system. From there, we have a section on why people invent languages. Now, the trio of Auxlang, Edgelang, Artlang is aimed at motivations, but we have some specific people cited here. We get this little mind map that has some normal examples, but also to revitalize natlangs, for money or prestige. I will say, people generally don't get money and prestige from conlanging. Currently, the market only supports 2 full-time professional conlangers, and they work as a team. But are people motivated by it? González cites Charles Bliss, the creator of Bliss symbolics. I don't know if I would call Bliss symbolics a language, and I also am not sure of Bliss's motivations. He is certainly an eccentric figure with his famous disapproval of the use of his system to help disabled people communicate in natural languages. She also cites a man named Edward Rulloff, who committed fraud, theft, and murder while also working on a really bonkers theory of philology. She lists him as a conlanger, but in my brief research, I don't see any evidence of him creating a language. We just have fragments of his theory that existing languages were created in secret by a cabal of elites through a method that has since been lost. That's just a weird guy to highlight in an intro conlanging book. We also get this little note.
Some scholars consider Cornish, Hawaiian, modern Hebrew, and Maori to be invented in a way, since they involve conscious design of vocabulary and grammar, at least to some extent.
Let me first just show you my annotation for that quote. And yes, I read academic books with a pencil, though I think I annotated this one a lot more than the Peterson book. There have been debates as to whether some revived languages count as conlangs. It's a topic I would consider quite fraught. I'll just say, yes, a lot of language revivals require some deliberate reconstruction, some more so than others. In grad school, I met a man who was aiming to assist the revival of the Miami, Illinois language, and part of that effort involved filling in missing words by reconstructing them based on other Algonquian languages. But I'm going to say, I don't think that deliberate reconstruction or planning makes a revived language a conlang. But working out why would really take a whole other video. I'm also really wary of bringing it up this way in an intro text, precisely because it requires a lot of nuance. I'm going to jump over the next two sections. They're a bit rambling and unfocused, but I really want to get to section 1.7, the first guided conlanging practice. Now you may be thinking, what are we doing in a guided conlanging practice in the first chapter? Maybe we have an exercise to decide what kind of conlang we want to make. No, that's not what we're doing. Essentially, this is designed as a microcosm for the whole book. She introduces the setup for the language of which is divided into 4 themed dialects. I'll talk more about that in a minute. But first, let's take a look at this incredible table. Okay, so these are, I guess, meant to be a set of inspirations for the sound of a language. But look at them. We have a few that can describe a physical sound you could achieve. I probably could get a language that sounds choppy or raspy or airy. But a lot of these seem to be just inviting people to invoke their own stereotypes. What makes a language sound archaic? For an English speaker, it might be markers of Latin, complex case declensions, long-derived words, etc. For a Chinese speaker, it would actually be shorter words because classical Chinese has fewer compounds. Now, she does actually acknowledge this relative perspective later on, but I think in the context of what else she says later, this doesn't look good. Put a pin in it. All right, so what else is here? Basically, we have all of the steps of making a language in miniature. We're selecting out vowels and consonants, making some words and some compounds, building morphology, getting basic syntax down, and then translating a few sentences. I get what this is trying to do. It's sort of a warm-up exercise to get you started, but I really don't see a lot of value here. If your students come in here with no background in linguistics, then they're just getting hit with a bunch of things you haven't taught them about. They're selecting sounds without knowing IPA and trying to build a whole language based on terms they might not fully understand. Plus, we have a weird choice to have the Romanized vowel bank include both U umlaut and Y. What vowels are those meant to represent separately? I feel if you want a warm-up that doesn't require previous linguistics knowledge, there's a better way to do it. Maybe have people play around with making individual words that sound nice, or give them a toy language they can manipulate to see the results of a couple of micro decisions. I just don't feel like this exercise is the right thing for beginners, especially if they don't have a linguistics background. The second chapter is about world building, which is on its face a good thing to have. I praise the world building section in Peterson's book for outlining a ton of cultural and environmental choices that will affect your conlang. And we do get some discussion here of how culture affects your language. Sounds good, right? Well, there are a number of problems. Most egregious is this little passage on page 21.
How can cultural tendencies be conveyed in a conlang? One way to do so is to use sounds that suggest specific qualities. For example, Sindarin features many light sounds such as L or N, while Klingon and Dothraki use guttural sounds suggesting force and aggressiveness, at least from the point of view of English speakers.
Remember that list of descriptors in the beginning? I think this is where that comes from. González is concerned with getting a particular sound out of a language as a reflection of culture. Except this isn't cultural influence on language. This is phonesthetics. She's talking about phonesthetics, and not in a very good way either. We'll set aside the association of cultural traits to sound for the moment, while I point out that her descriptions of these languages is very off. The fact that Sindarin has L and N, extremely common sounds, is not what makes it sound the way it does. It's the phonotactics of the language, which are restricted to avoid consonant clusters Tolkien considered harsh. The same is true of Klingon. Yes, it has guttural sounds, notably a uvular affricate, k, which does stick out. But the key to Klingon sound is that it doesn't allow open syllables. Every syllable starts and ends with a consonant, which isn't a restriction we find in natural languages and leads to a very choppy, clipped sound.
Lord Lich la big bog vai willich fu. Took me much, tight mo me, careless.
In other words, the phonotactics determine the sound of a language a lot more than the sound inventory. But more importantly, I really think this is encouraging people to lean into stereotypes when creating languages. González acknowledges that these associations can be culturally specific to the creator, citing that Arabic speakers may find guttural sounds less harsh since their own native language has them, by which I assume she's using guttural to refer to uvulars and pharyngeals. But she still encourages people to use phonology to reflect culture. I'm going to go a step further on this. If we really want to talk about what makes a language sound harsh or soft or whatever, you have to account for the fact that basically any language can sound many different ways based on the vocal delivery. I mean, think about harsh. What makes a language harsh? Maybe I could build a sound system that maximizes harsh sounds, but I really think that the vocal performance matters a whole lot more than the phonology of a given language. Here, I'll illustrate with a snippet from the opening monologue of my Conlang feature for Ndakaga, my take on D&D's Draconic. You might expect me to design a language for dragons to be harsh, but I really didn't go that way. Its most notable phonological features are the fact that schwa can be stressed, that it allows initial nasal obstruent clusters, and most importantly, that it completely lacks rounded vowels, which is a very non-naturalistic choice I made based on the idea that dragon lips are not flexible enough to do lip rounding, at least in my estimation. And of course, I can make this sound quite pleasant if I give a relatively neutral delivery. Ndakaga. Ndakaga ifedu de ide ubike. Kaga if agubetubacha. Or I can make it sound more villainous by delivering it in a much angrier, sharper voice. Ndakaga. Ndakaga ifedu de ide ubike. Kaga if agubetubacha. It's only when I activate my false vocal folds and add some effects that I really sound like a dragon. And I can get the same harsh delivery in English. Here we go.
Wing voice. Wing voice is what giantlings call it. We call it the voice.
Imagine that. By changing the delivery, we change the harshness of the language. I'm not saying you can't make a language that is biased to sound a certain way, but I would much prefer to focus on more concrete ideas of what you want your language to sound like. If you ask me to make a language that sounds like a particular language family, like a Slavic-inspired language or a Chinese-like language, I can look up those phonological systems and build something similar. If you want a language that sounds breathy or clipped or musical, I can interpret that in a way that makes sense and has an artistic vision behind it. I'm not going to make a language that sounds harsh or noble, though. I don't see it as particularly useful to try, and I don't like the way it pushes me to lean into stereotypes about real languages. And it doesn't help that she uses descriptors like these in most of the phonology exercises. Also, please stop with guttural. I know guttural has a phonetic meaning, but it is so incredibly overused by fantasy and sci-fi writers that when any given person uses it, I really don't know what they mean by it at first. And I will bet that some linguistically naive students won't know what it means beyond weird and exotic. All of this confusing of phonesthetics with cultural world building comes at the expense of a section on how culture affects the lexicon later in the chapter, which is far too short. And that's weird because culture lives in the lexicon. The part of the language that is most affected by cultural forces is the meanings of words. Sure, all language is culturally learned, but the lexicon has the most direct tie to culture and gets the most intentional manipulation from speakers seeking to express their social and political ideas. Reading these chapters is basically enough for me not to want to recommend this book. It is so weak on Conlang theory and world building, with so many errors and issues, that I'd like to just give up. But I have a review copy in hand from Cambridge University Press, and I figured I would read the whole thing and review it. After all, maybe after a shaky start, some of the actual linguistics portions are better presented. Foreshadowing is a literary device. Let's zoom out a bit and talk about some overall impressions. One thing I noticed reading through the book is that it seemed kind of airy, much less dense than Peterson's book. Then I actually looked into that. Inventing Languages is 52 pages shorter than How to Create a Language, not counting appendices, index, and references in the back. It also looks like it has larger print, or at least more line spacing. Remember how the 3 types of Conlangs was like a page in the González book? That's nearly 7 pages in the Peterson book, and Peterson still is much more focused on the 3 major types. Now, a shorter book isn't necessarily bad. A less dense, easy to read book could be helpful for some readers. Like, I'm thinking of making a series of intro conlanging videos, and they probably won't be as dense as the Peterson book, because I'm not going to make y'all watch super long videos. So yeah, that's fine. But if you're going to limit your space like that, you've got to use your space efficiently. We've already seen some bits of inefficiency, but before we get into linguistics, let's talk a bit more about the world building chapter. There is a somewhat rambling discussion of genre and a little more about culture affecting language before González suggests 2 concrete world building artifacts that you need before starting your language: a map and a cultural text. Now, I don't really hate this section. González includes examples of maps and texts from her students, which I think is neat. Most of the maps actually break the mold of a standard modern fantasy map and go cool places with it. But even seeing this in the table of contents, I asked myself, why are we making a map? Listen, a map can certainly be helpful in conlanging. Any world building you've done will help. If you've already made a map of your world, you should absolutely reference it. But coming from the perspective of teaching a first-time conlanger who may not have any world-building experience, I would not ask them for this for 2 reasons. First, it's not essential. Yeah, it's good to have a sense of where your speakers live and what the environment is like. But I've made languages without maps before. The last time I made a map related to a conlang was way back in 2007 for Yelpach, and the map came after I started the language. Just some notes on the local environment is fine for your first project. Second, fantasy cartography is its own skill that you probably should be learning somewhere else. Putting together some notes on the local culture and environment can take a little research, but it's not as specialized and gives you a better return on the quality of your language. But I'm not going to require you to learn to draw a map when my main goal is to teach you how to make a language. I'm being fairly nice about the world building section, but after Artifexian, a recently retired YouTuber who is much more into the physical geography side than I am, looked at it, he just kind of felt like there was not much to it anyway. Like she wasn't teaching people much about how to make realistic maps. So even this section, which I felt was pretty unnecessary, apparently is not teaching very well either. Now, the in-world cultural text is much more understandable. The idea is to both use the text to develop some baseline about your speaker's culture and have a translation text to work from. My only concern here is that by making the translation text this early, your students will be likely to overfit their language to that text, making the words and grammar necessary to translate it and not to use it elsewhere. If you've participated in or watched Agma Schwa's Cursed Conlang Circus, you might be familiar with this issue. I suspect most CCC participants, myself included, really just make enough of the language to get through the given translation text, or maybe a little more for examples. And that's fine for a time-limited challenge, but I'm just a little wary of defining a translation text up front for a semester-long project. For what it's worth, it is written by the students, and González does later suggest using some standard translation text. So again, the text is not as much of an issue as the map. Backing up again, let's talk a little bit about organization. At first glance, the organization of the book sounds solid. After the Conlangian world-building chapters, we have a number of chapters on phonology, then move on to the lexicon, then morphology, then into increasingly more complex morphosyntax topics, and then on to topics like writing, pragmatics, and variation. There is an oddity that we get to a discussion of language channels and modalities in the second to last chapter, which is something that really should be earlier. If a student decides to make a sign language, that decision has to come at the very beginning. It's also a little odd that writing is closer to the middle, when I'd put it maybe second to last. But since it's after major grammar is complete, that seems fine. But digging into the actual chapters, you start to see more problems. For example, the concept of phonemes is introduced just awkwardly in the middle of the vowels chapter, in a section that's less than a page and basically just teaches what minimal pairs are. Allophones are introduced later in the consonants chapter, and they aren't even given a section of their own. They're just shoved into the section on place of articulation. If you've ever taken an intro linguistics course, you know how weird this is. The conventional way to do this is to introduce articulatory phonetics first, where you learn the International Phonetic Alphabet, all the articulators, the vowel space, and all that, and then introduce phonemes and allophony, as well as phonological processes. People don't do it that way out of blind tradition. Linguistics courses are structured this way because it works. Students need to build on the foundation of phonetics to get how psychological structures in phonology work. You have to first train them to hear the sounds as they are, then work on why people perceive them differently. Most students are not going to get it if you just haphazardly scatter fundamental concepts of phonology into your discussion of the phonetics of vowels and consonants. And this is not the only problem here. She has a tendency to produce these charts of percentages in the phonology sections, and I'm not really sure how well some of these work didactically, especially when you have a ton of things with the same very small percentages. I've worked with linguistic statistics for my dice tables, but for a beginner text, I much prefer to teach people how sounds are arranged systematically, which we do get some of for the vowels. I also think that some of these stats are given a bit naively. Take this chart of geminates. Note that the most common one is only in 3% of languages. This seemed really odd to me because I can rattle off well-known languages with gemination easily. Italian, Japanese, Finnish, Swedish. It occurs in a lot of languages across a lot of families. So, what's going on? In case you're not familiar, geminates are long consonants. We don't have them contrastively in English, but they can show up incidentally in some phrases or compounds, like black cat. Crucially, geminates often occur at syllable boundaries. So while the notation González uses with an IPA long mark is used, it's also quite common for linguists to transcribe a geminate as two of the same consonant split between two syllables. González's source for these stats is Foible, which is a big database of phoneme inventories that's really the default source for this kind of information. However, having worked with Foible data, it is incredibly messy. Many languages have multiple inventories listed, and the default presentation of including every diacritic modified version of a phone can make it hard to get some of the stats you're looking for. And for this chart specifically, I immediately saw a potential problem. Seeing as she's using the length mark notation, I assume she got this data by searching for those specifically. But as I said, not all linguists will use that notation for geminates. Let's look at some languages we know have geminates. Standard Arabic has one inventory listed in Foible. Looking at this, do we see any consonants with length markers? No. Okay, Turkish has 4 inventories. Surely one of them will show the geminates as consonants with a length marker, right? No. Let's look at a language that does show the length markers. Italian has 3 inventories. One of them has consonants with length markers in the phonemes. Another has them only in allophones. And then the third inventory just doesn't list consonants with length markers. The only conclusion I can draw here is that many linguists are just not using the notation she's looking for, and instead explain geminates elsewhere. So my question would be, how many languages are not being counted by this search because their inventories don't use this notation. Also, even if Gemnits are rarer than I thought, can I really trust the difference between 1 and 3% if there's this much noise? Even with a sample of over 2,000 languages, I don't think we can trust it on this one. The fact is, this chart didn't need to be there. Just an explanation of what Gemnits are and a few examples would work. The individual frequencies are not that helpful because all you really need to decide is what classes of consonants can become Gemnits in your language. And that often just falls out of phonotactics and assimilation rules. This might seem nitpicky, but I really worry that if she made this chart and didn't see the obvious problems with it, that I'm not sure I can trust her other statistics. She does frequently mention a feature that only occurs in 1% of languages, and I don't know if that means as much as she thinks it does. She also confidently declares that German has the most vowels at 14 and Yimas the least at 2. But counting vowels, particularly at the extremes, is not at all straightforward. Yes, German has a lot of vowels. Germanic languages tend to. But if we're just counting monophthongs, Danish has just as many. And we haven't gone into exploring different phonemic analysis or the vowel systems of different dialects. After I looked at the vowel charts that I showed you, I realized that actually 14 vowels can be correct for German, but you can get as high as 16. So that also illustrates, yeah, okay, that would mean that German, according to an analysis, would have more vowels than Danish. Okay. But it also illustrates the uncertainty involved here and why I'm objecting to the idea of declaring which language has the most vowels and which language has the least, because you have these differences in analysis, differences in dialects. Our data may be incomplete because not every language is in foible, not every language has a phonology described. Anyway, back to the rest. Also, there are languages that have been analyzed as having just one phonemic vowel. So you cannot just declare Yimas, the smallest, even if you're sure that it has two. This is another stat that I would simply leave out of the book. You don't need to tell people this. Just the overall distribution and common systems are enough. I don't have time to go back and reinvestigate all of the stats in this book. I think most of them just don't need to be there. And this is from someone who uses dice tables for conlanging. Some representation of frequency on the main vowel and consonant charts is probably all we really need here. Let's move on to the examples used throughout the book. On the Nat Lang side, it's okay. She relies pretty heavily on English and Spanish, but there's a good bit of Basque and a number of other Nat Langs as she needs them to illustrate things. I don't mind the heavy Spanish because it's familiar, and she is both a native speaker and a specialist in Spanish, so she turns up some interesting features that I wouldn't have known about, such as this word disque, which can function like an indirect evidential in Latin American Spanish. There are places where we could do with less English. Yes, it's the language of the book and the most known language in the world, but some of the English examples just aren't very informative. For example, this list on page 216 of different kinds of English commands. What are these descriptors? Are we sure all English speakers are going to have the same intuition on what these constructions mean? Some of them maybe, but Others are a bit subjective. More importantly, is this helping people make a choice about their conlangs? Beyond just the idea that you can have varying structures for attempts to change other people's behavior, I don't really know that it is. I'll also mention that there were a lot of places where some language was mentioned as having a feature that I'd like illustrated, and it left me thinking, well, where are the examples? You can't just drop the name of this language. I want to see this in action. A little of that is expected, but it seemed to happen far too often. On the Conlang side, well, I was left very confused about González's example choices for most of the book. Mostly the Conlang examples were sort of a rotation of several very famous languages. Most commonly, you will see Dothraki, Esperanto, Klingon, Ladan, Na'vi, and Tokipona, with Quenya and Sindarin taken together, adding up quite a bit as well. Again, this was confusing to me. Obviously, Esperanto and Tokipona are not naturalistic at all and not meant to be. So I would have been wary of using them as examples if the goal was to teach people how to make a language for a fictional culture. Laadan is also not meant to be naturalistic, being an in-world conlang, though it has some interesting points that I might bring up in some morphology sections. Klingon is also very surprising. Klingon is meant to represent the language of a fictional culture, but Mark Okrand made it deliberately alien in a lot of different ways. I mentioned the weird phonotactics before, but it also is kind of a grab bag of extremely rare or unattested features. It's historically important, and I think it can be useful, but I'd be very selective in where I used it as an example. And González clearly is not selective about it. In one instance, she mentions that Klingon clause coordinators are just the noun coordinators backwards, without telling students that this in particular is not something natural languages do. Do it if you think it's cool, but know that it's odd, and just having the same coordinators is much more likely. I'll also note that the only conlang that was brought up as much as some of these in Peterson's book was Juadi. She spread examples around to her own, David's, and some community languages, giving much better diversity in sources and typology than González gives. Now, González told me that she did deliberately choose conlangs that would be more familiar to students. And I will say, I don't think that familiarity is that useful in the examples in the book. It's useful for marketing. It's useful for your intro to ground things, but a lot of students wouldn't know any of these languages anyway. And plus, just like you want diverse NatLang examples, you want diverse Conlang examples. So, given that, and that the particular examples she chose are ones I don't really agree with using in a lot of the cases, yeah, it doesn't really work for me as an argument. There were also languages, if you could call them that I just wouldn't have used. I mentioned Lapine above, but it gets brought up quite a few times in the text, despite the fact that it's basically just a few isolated words. She also frequently references heptapod A and B, the spoken and written languages of the heptapods in Arrival. These are not languages. Heptapod A was just sound design, and heptapod B consists of about 100 logographic glyphs with no systematic grammar. time would have been better spent going out to the Conlanging community to find interesting languages, but she does very little of that. The modality section does have references to Rikchik and gripping, probably because it's difficult to find interesting modalities among the more famous languages. And we do get Kaelin mentioned once in a while. But overall, she seems to stick to this pop culture zeitgeist even when the examples are not that useful. If I were to go through and catalog and investigate all the errors and problems in this book, it'd probably take me a year and produce a 4-hour video. And I don't know if I can be that kind of YouTuber. There's things like the first mention of determiners stating they are also referred to as articles, even though she does mention determiners later and shows that she knows that demonstrative determiners are a thing. There's her implication that logographic and logosyllabic mean the same thing. No, Egyptian is not logosyllabic. That's not a good term for it. Also, the whole section on logograms is just really misleading about the development of those systems and how they work. No, ma'am. It's not a small number of Hansa that are logograms. Phonosemantic compounds are still logograms. They just have phonetic hinting. So I was just taking pictures of the book and I stumbled across things that I had forgotten about. Things that are just like big errors involved in basic ideas about linguistics is the degree of synthesis. She says analytic languages have one morpheme per word. Synthetic languages have multiple morphemes per word, but one root per word, and then polysynthetic multiple morphemes per word and multiple roots per word. What are you talking about? Multiple roots per word, that's a compound. Probably almost all languages would have some kind of compounding. English has compounding. Blackbird, that's 2 roots in a word. Chinese has compounding. And Chinese is definitely analytic. Chinese, Vietnamese, these like languages that we think of as like the prime example of analytic. Polysynthetic isn't even a well-defined term, but just beyond that, by her definition, we could classify Chinese as polysynthetic, and that's not how this works. It's just analytic means that sort of the grammatical morphemes are separated from the content words mainly. And there are fewer morphemes per word, but there's not just one. And then the degree is like a more synthetic language is one that has more inflectional morphology attached to content words. But that's not how she describes it. There's a lot of odd or erroneous terminology used, which is exacerbated by her tendency that we saw in the first chapter of just throwing out terms that aren't needed or aren't sufficiently explained. But off of that, another thing that affects the whole book is her choice of examplishes. Examplish is what I call a conlang that's made for a text like this, that you follow through the book or lessons as a running example of how to make conlanging choices and develop the various components of a language. Think of squirrelish in Peterson's book, except González didn't do something like squirrelish, which has a very simple premise of squirrels who gain sapience without too much upfront complexity. She has 2 examplishes for most of the book. We've mentioned which is divided into a number of different dialects with their own thematic ideas. There's also the salt language, or Mook, which we are introduced to with a map and a ton of information about how they relate to other cultures. And there's my issue. Why are we front-loading with discussions of variation in language contact? If you are going a priori, your first conlanging project is most likely going to be an isolate, that is, a language with no known relatives, and one that doesn't show a lot of contact with other languages. An isolated isolate, you could say. As you develop your world, you can start to develop other languages and weave in contact effects. Or you can do that with your second or third project. Even if you go a posteriori, you probably want to focus more on internal development early on, then think about influence from other languages. Maybe she feels that's boring, but if this textbook is targeted at beginners, you need to start small, and she constantly misses that. She doesn't have well-defined exercises. She throws out too many terms at once, running the risk of overwhelming or confusing students. She gives laundry lists of rare features when it would be better to keep it to broad, common ones. If you just list out tons of options, you're going to encourage kitchen sink conlanging, where people just shove every interesting idea into one inconsistent, overcomplicated mess. Better to give common variations and a sense of how different grammatical features fit together. Then students can go find the less common features and research them on their own. In the end of the book, I was still getting surprises. I looked at her translation text and was surprised that it was just in IPA with no romanization. Then I looked up romanization in the book to see whether she even taught people about it. Here is what I found.
Representing sounds with the letters of the Latin or Roman alphabet is referred to as romanization. Many conlangs, Tokiponets and Natvi, are rendered this way. However, romanization can be problematic since sound letter correspondences are not always straightforward. For example, letters might be silent, that is, not pronounced. Two adjacent letters might correspond to a single sound, and one single letter might correspond to two sounds.
After this, she goes on to talk more about both inconsistencies in English spelling and differences between languages in how letters are pronounced before arguing for IPA. And the argument for using IPA is valuable in the context of developing your phonology. But apparently she never comes back to teach romanization and just assumes it's entirely useless. Romanization is just standard practice. Yes, you use IPA to develop and present your phonology. It's useful for that. But IPA is hard to read, annoying to type, and unfamiliar for non-linguists. It is for phonetic transcription, not for everyday language use. If you are going to present your language to other people or include it in a work of fiction, you're going to need a romanization. I don't know how much experience González has with languages not natively written in the Roman alphabet, but linguists use romanization all the time. If you write about Chinese or Arabic or Russian or any number of languages, you're probably used to using romanization in examples. Unless you're writing about ancient Greek. Classicists love untransliterated Greek for some reason. That aside, I think one thing that I take away from this book is a lack of focus. Near the end of the book, the author gives a note asking whether we should care about naturalism.
On working through this book, perhaps you've asked yourself to what extent your conlang needs to follow natlang tendencies. We've maintained that conlangs need to be plausible, but the best conlangs are unique and push the limits of what a language can or could do.
And to an extent, I agree with this sentiment. Seeing this laid out also makes some of those earlier choices more clear. the neglecting of the naturalism axis and the very unnaturalistic examples makes sense with this philosophy. It would have been nice if this approach was spelled out up front. At the same time, I would still be critical of the implementation of that philosophy here. Yeah, languages that break the mold in some way are interesting, but this book is intended as an introduction to conlanging for students who may have no background in linguistics. Peterson's approach here was to focus on naturalistic artlangs because, as she said, if you want to bend or break the rules in your work, you need to first understand what the rules are. By constantly using unnaturalistic examples, as well as failing to follow best practices in intro-linguistics instruction and just having so many errors, González fails to provide that baseline. And for that reason, I just can't recommend this book. If you are considering a conlanging textbook for a course or for your own study, the Peterson book is a far, far better option. And if your professor is using the González book, I would suggest you send them this video to give a conlanger's perspective on it. I am very disappointed in this book. It would take a ton of editing to turn this into something I could recommend. If Carolina González is listening and is willing to take some advice on a second edition, I suggest two things. First, engage with the conlanging community. We have been teaching each other how to do this for decades. We have our own theory and our own best practices that we could help you with. I promise that we could help you improve. My second point here was going to be listen to people with experience teaching intro linguistics. But before I came out with the video, she came back to me and said she has more than 20 years of experience teaching intro and descriptive linguistics outside of conlanging. And, you know, she's been teaching the conlanging course for a while, and that's sort of intro level too. So maybe that doesn't apply directly to her as much as I thought. What I will say instead of that, particularly directed at González, is maybe you should compare your book to intro textbooks in terms of how they're organized and think a little bit about that, because with the problems I find in organization in this book, my most charitable opinion on that is maybe she is doing some things that worked all right in the classroom when students could go off of each other and ask clarifying questions and there were other activities involved, but aren't necessarily ideal for structuring a textbook. Things like the weird placement of the concept of phonemes and allophones and just some things that are in places that I didn't expect them to be. So that might be my advice. I hope that she is listening, and I hope that anyone else who wants to write a conlanging book is also listening. Because again, I want there to be more resources out there. Just please do it well. In any case, if you want to hear about a better option for a conlanging textbook, I'll have that video linked at the end. Also, I have heard that some of my audience isn't really able to get academic books like these. I totally understand that the price of these books is prohibitive for some people, and not everyone has access to a university library. So I think in the near future, I'm going to put together a video on free resources you can use to learn. If you found some value in this video, please hit the like button. And if you're interested in conlanging, please consider subscribing. I'm still a modest channel, but I'm very encouraged with what the growth of this channel means for my ability to promote this hobby. And as always, thanks to my patrons who get to vote in polls for my Tongues and Runes languages and can get early access to videos. Thank you all for watching, and happy conlanging.